This
agenda item.
conference will now be recorded.
Does anyone have any changes to the agenda?
Yes.
Jessica, this is not an agenda change necessarily, but I wanted to point out that at the end of the last meeting, we seem to have kind of closed the conversation on Article 12 for that time without discussing the Michael's information about the habitat block transitional areas. And I wasn't sure if that Article 12 conversation is closed because we never got to that. So I don't know if we want to do that in this conversation or if we can warn it for the next.
Well, I don't think we should add the habitat block conversation to tonight because it's definitely not on the agenda, and that would be like a different warning.
Yeah.
Michael, does this?
Yes, on that, I think it should be done at the next meeting in which we work on Article 12, because there's quite a lot to do on the subject that Monica raised. And to answer your question, yes, I have agenda changes too. Given the size of the agenda, I suggest moving item 4 to item 6, and item 5C. I would like to see us postpone it until we've completed our IZ work, which is something we agreed to do back in September. I mean, we've got so much work ahead of us. I think that would be a wise thing to do. And as I said, we agreed to do it already back in September.
Okay, I guess, Duncan, you have your hand up about.
I just wanted to, I think hopefully everybody read all the letters that we got in regards to that issue. And I don't know if this is the right time for it or not, Paul, but I was going to ask you, it seemed like in the memo that you had sent out, it made more sense to incorporate that now into the PUD process. And I don't know if that now's the time when we should have that discussion or we should wait.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it makes sense to keep C on the agenda, and at that time of the agenda 5C, I'll tell you why that agenda item is on the agenda. And we don't necessarily need to get into a lot of detail if everyone decides we don't want to, but can at least give some background at that time. And then, Michael, to your point about 4, Emily Charrington is here. And I was hoping we could keep that to be an extremely brief item because we already had all the information in our packet. So
Emily had also announced it to the neighborhood that this would be happening. I don't know if there's anybody who's attending, but just in case they did, we advertised the time for that. So
I'm okay with item 4 remaining where it is then. I'm still concerned about item 5C. Yes, 5C. I know it's the PUDs that we're working on are really complex, and there's a lot of work to be done yet, in my view. And you know, we've only completed one of the 4 items that the City Council charged us to do during interim zoning. We've still got to complete the PUDs. We've still got to complete the TDRs, and the cost benefits analysis, I guess, has been done. But those 2 are crucial for us, for the Planning Commission to complete during our.
So I think the idea of whether or not it's on the agenda and the idea of whether or not you want to pursue it are actually kind of a little different. So let's just leave the agenda where it is. It does say time permitting, so we might not even get to it. And we don't need to move forward with it. I mean, that's why it's on the agenda, to see if it's even something we want to talk about.
I just, you know, I just object because we agreed to not to take on anything else while while we're trying to complete 12 and 15 back in September, and we're going to go back on that agreement. You can make that decision, but
Okay.
I don't think it's right.
Well, thank you, Michael. Ted? And we're not hearing you, Ted, even though it doesn't look like you're on mute.
Well, Ted, I suspect that your computer probably has the wrong thing listed as the microphone or something like that. So if you wanted, you could either try to leave and come back in, or if you wanted to mute the computer and then dial in by telephone, then you could participate the audio by telephone.
So while you guys are working through some of these minor details, my computer is telling me I need to restart because I had some software installed. So I'm just going to bump off for like a minute or two, but I'll be back.
Very good.
Yeah.
We will still have a quorum, so we will keep going. Anything else, or we'll move on to open?
I guess I have one sort of clarification based on Monica and Michael's request around Article 12. I'm perfectly fine with doing that. I was, after the last meeting, the plan, the guidance that I had was to release Article 12 to the public. Do you want me to hold on that for your next meeting so that you can discuss this stuff before sort of saying to people it's out there and ready for comment?
I would
don't
say
think
yes.
it's necessary to hold it, but I mean, the public would just have to understand it's still a draft and it's not ready for, so whatever you think is more clear so things are not confused for the public is fine with me.
Well, I think some of the things are key to have done before the public sees it, particularly when it comes to buffers around habitat blocks and habitat purposes. Okay, there's Ted.
Okay, so Ted, we need you to turn off your speaker on your computer so you don't get the feedback.
There you go.
Okay.
Can you hear us, Ted?
Ted, I think that your computer is still doing the audio in some way. Sorry.
Okay. I'll leave.
Well, you don't need to leave, but maybe, well, it went away, so maybe did you mute for the moment? Is that?
Yeah, seems.
Everything seems good. Okay, announcements and staff report. Does anyone have any announcements? Ted, did you have something to add to that last part? Okay, then any other announcements?
Ted, do you have a landline?
Well, I guess we'll forge ahead.
Yep.
I think Ted can probably still hear us. We're just not hearing him. Okay, so number 4 is the presentation of the proposed design for Lindwood Drive stormwater. We have Emily. I might not have said that right.
Carrington, you got it.
Yeah, welcome from our stormwater department here. And she provided with quite a bit of information in our packet. So, you know, I think we're pretty familiar with all of that information. So I guess if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, go ahead.
Should I go through the actual PowerPoint? That was what I was intending to do.
I
It's entirely up to you. I wasn't sure if people from the street were actually going to show up for the meeting.
I think it would be good if you could go through it, but, you know, fairly rapidly.
yeah, maybe
Really rapidly. Hang on, I'm having troubles getting the share screen to work.
So it is sharing, and what we see is the GoToMeeting Have a Great Meeting browser window.
Yeah, I can't get it to switch to my other. Here, I'll try going out and coming back into it. Is that looking better?
Yes.
There we go. That looks promising. So I did slightly alter this, not knowing if any community folks from the road were going to show up, but I can breeze through those sections because I'm pretty sure you are all pretty aware of our stormwater concerns in South Burlington. But I'm Emily Charrington. I'm stormwater project manager for the city. And so we have a number of designs currently in development, and this one is on Lindenwood Drive. Oops. So the project is within the Potash Brook Watershed, which is shown here on this map. It's just over 7 square miles of area and obviously encompasses a lot of the heavily developed sections of the city. So a lot of impervious surfaces. Potash Brook is listed as being impaired, and with our MS4 permitting back in 2012, the city had to come up with a flow restoration plan to start remedying the issues within the stream. And so we have to reduce the high flow by 16.5%. And this project is within the FRP listings. I think 107 total were called out, and so this is among them, and it was one of the higher priority ones. This is an image of the actual drainage area that would be incorporated. So it's the upper portion of Lindenwood Drive as well as a section of Brewer Parkway that currently just direct discharges into the stream, and there's no closed system on Lindenwood Drive at all. But there's significant flooding with small storm events there. So on the left, you see young kids playing in the significant flooding, having a great old time. And on the right is an image of the stream tributary to Potash Brook, where the outfall from Brewer Parkway flows. And in the summertime, there's definitely a lot of erosion in that stream when after a rainstorm. So the project that we have proposed is to install a collection system along Lindenwood Drive. I think it's 8 catch basins that we have designed along there, along with a storm pipe, and then also capture the Brewer Parkway flow and pipe them both into a dry detention basin in that last lot on Lindenwood Drive, which is city-owned. It's within the Farrell Park parcel. And we received a grant from VTrans to complete the project. And so they're providing just over $303,000 towards the design and construction, and the city has to match 20%, the other 20%, which equates to about $76,000. So essentially, the dry detention basin will provide channel protection by slowing down the runoff. It will detain the water from the 1-year storm event, which equates to 2.1 inches within a 24-hour duration, and then it will slowly release it back into the stream over an extended period. And it will also provide pretreatment in the pretreatment tank to help clean up the stream and water quality, remove pollutants that our crew will then periodically go and clean. So this is the proposed location. It's always been sort of a mode area that owners of that last parcel there have sort of incorporated it as part of their yard over the years. But you can see the way we have it designed, the bike path will continue to just sort of sneak around it and won't be impacted by the overall design of it.
Who owns that lot, Emily?
It's a city-owned lot.
Okay, good. And the area of the dry pond,
That's within the city lot. It's
Yeah,
all
no, I
within
mean-
that Farrell Park.
Yeah, what is the area of the dry pond?
Oh, the overall surface area?
Yeah,
I don't
roughly.
know that off the top of my head.
Never mind.
I don't know. Yeah, we've played around with the dimensions in so many different ways. I don't know that final number.
Okay.
I put the overall plan on this slide. I took the one that you had in your packet to show the overall design of it, but you can see the house here. And so there will be an access road. We can incorporate grass back onto it, so you won't really be able to tell that it's a drive, but at least our Vector will be able to be supported to get into this structure to clean. And then the bike path is just outside the limits, so it does utilize most of that space.
Oh, okay.
Do you have another question?
No, I'm assuming
Okay.
you're going to access it with the right of way.
So the right is all actually within the city right away.
Okay,
This
great.
whole project. Yeah,
Excellent.
makes life much easier. So we ran through a few alternatives, some of them to try to appease the neighborhood, some of them to try to protect. There's a few really large, beautiful trees on the southern edge of the parcel. And just go back. So right in here, there's a row of really nice trees. And so originally we had designed a pre-treatment tank, but I was really worried about the root zone of those trees. And so I had the designer pull that tank out of there. And so we're piping everything into one tank, which hopefully I think we can get through there without causing too much damage if we do some root pruning. We also had to relocate the original design away from the water transmission line, which runs on the southern side of Lindenwood Drive. And then the owners of that last parcel had asked us to consider looking at placing the project down below the bike path, across the bike path, so that we wouldn't be utilizing that green space that they've always incorporated into their lawn. And so we did do the engineering analysis on that, but it just did not seem like there weren't enough benefits to it. We would have had to do a lot of tree removal. Bank stabilization would have been a concern. Access to the clean out structure would have been a concern for our Vector truck. And there would have been an increase in wetland impacts. So we ended up bringing it back up top to where we had originally proposed. And then in the effort of sort of keeping it, knowing that there's a neighborhood with potential visual impacts and people are using that area to access the bike path, we do have a landscaping budget incorporated into the plan. And so hopefully we can incorporate some nice native plants that can increase bird habitat, wildlife habitat, fall foliage, winter interest, things of that nature. And then also we intend to fence it. I think these can kind of go either way because they are made to drain relatively quickly, but I think for safety's sake, we're going to want to fence it just to, if there's kids on the bike path or whatever, just to keep everybody safe. So we would probably propose a split rail fence similar to this one, which is a little more aesthetically pleasing than like the big old chain link fence you sometimes see around our system. Our overall schedule, we're in pretty good shape. We have all of our permitting completed. We're moving into our 60% design phase, which includes all of the right-of-way work, which won't be much in this one. And so we're anticipating to put it out to bid next winter, so it could be constructed spring of 2022 is the goal. Again, I'm the project manager. My contact info, if anybody wants to ask more questions or reach out to me, feel free. Are there any questions?
Quick. Yes.
Mike,
The type of fencing, the split rail fencing that you've shown, which is on another pond that I've seen down here, will that allow small critters to get underneath? Will there be a gap at the bottom?
We usually bring that wire mesh down to the bottom, but our crew has complained about weed whacking around these fences. So it might be, that might be a concept that we have to toy with. Maybe we do leave a gap. Are you concerned about critters getting in, or do you want to keep critters out?
I want to let them in.
You want to let them in.
Yeah.
I think one concern that we have with critters is sometimes we get muskrats in our ponds, and they can cause a lot of erosion on the banks. That would be my only main concern for allowing them in. I could see where giving them a source of water would be advantageous to them.
So we did talk about this recently with someone else from the stormwater department. I think that's what Paul was just going to bring up. Did you want to add that?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Emily, I was going to encourage you to touch base with Dave Wheeler, because Dave was working with the Planning Commission on some amendments to our rules around stormwater treatment facilities. And the commission had a good discussion with him about actually exactly this picture. So maybe you can circle back with him, and Dave had some ideas about how to keep the ponds safe, but also encourage wildlife passage.
Okay, sounds good.
Monica, did that cover your question?
Yeah, it's just, yeah, exactly. The same thing. I mean, these are currently, this one was, and this new one we're talking about is currently habitat area. So this is understandable work that has to be done, but doing whatever we can to ensure that the natural habitats that are there can still cross it, use it as they need to. You know, I think that's really important. And with the muskrats, if there's anything that we can do to just make that part of the maintenance program, or select plants that would either help protect given the muskrats, but I think it's really important when we're interfering with current habitat to just continue to work with it as much as possible. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think we could also, we could always incorporate little culvert entrances or something like that too in the future, if something like that might be easier. But I know our crew similarly has a lot of trouble weed whacking around these fences. So the more we can lift it to help them would also be advantageous.
Any other questions or anything from the public? If you're in the public and trying to get our attention, you can turn your camera on, you can unmute, or you can put something in the chat. I'm not hearing anything else. Do you need any action from us, Emily, or is it?
Nope. It was we just have to provide a community presentation just to engage any questions or comments.
Great.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Take care.
Great.
Okay, we had some kind of hiccups at the very beginning, so I just want to make sure. Ted, did you have something you wanted to say before the meeting started? Okay. Or open to the public for items not related to the agenda. I think I sped through that because we were getting some feedback. Just want to make sure that I didn't miss anyone. Okay, well, if anyone does have anything, you can put it in the chat and we can circle back. Otherwise, we will move on to item 5, the land development regulations work session. Starting with A, the continuation of the review of the PUD traditional neighborhood development draft. So this is picking up essentially where we left off January 12th.
That's right. Well, thanks everyone. On January 12th, you started to discuss some of the key questions for both the PUD types, PUD language generally, and also the specifics of the traditional neighborhood. And I know that there were still some outstanding items that you didn't get to that night. I apologize for the leapfrogging, but it just worked out in the schedule to talk about natural resources on the 26th. So this is really to come back to that. And of course, any other things that you would like to talk about as it relates to the PUDs in general and the traditional neighborhood type. The only quick announcement that I have is that I've started to work with a subgroup of the Affordable Housing Committee to look specifically at the building types, which is one of the components of this, to get into some of the nitty gritty there, so they can give you some thoughts on that knowing that you've got a lot on your workload. So that's not to preclude you from weighing in on the same thing, but just trying to sort of spread some of the burden as well. So.
Sorry, Monica.
Thank you. I meant to bring this up at a previous meeting, I think, when we discussed this, and we just get to the end and it didn't come, I wasn't able to address it. 15C08, infill and redevelopment. I would like to, I know it's not being discussed tonight because we don't have the draft yet. I would like to ask the Planning Commission to consider delaying that work until after interim zoning. I think that there is so much that goes, infill and redevelopment is such an important PUD. I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of detail and need a lot of community input. And given the priorities within IZ, it just doesn't feel like it's possible to do it justice. We'll be compromising too many things. So I think it would, knowing in advance that one, if I don't know what the process would be to remove it for now, but I would just ask that we do consider tabling infill and redevelopment, and then after interim zoning, getting back into it. And I did get the Affordable Housing Committee's opinion on this, and they didn't seem to have hesitation with that. So I'm looking at it more from, I want to make sure that when the Planning Commission addresses infill and redevelopment, we really are thorough with it, and I'm afraid we'd be too compromised right now.
You need a second, or is that just a request?
Sure,
Also,
let's make it a motion.
Well, my only
Okay.
comment would be, you know, how do we currently handle infill and development? And, you know, is there anything that we need to address, or, you know, I'm okay with Monica's suggestion as long as, you know, we're not leaving a huge gap where, you know, it's unclear how we want to proceed, and, you know, maybe even things are proceeding in a direction that we don't want it to go. So, you know, I would just ask, you know, what are we doing now, and are we okay with what we're doing now to be able to do that or not?
Paul, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so just quickly, I think on the residential side, the effect would be essentially that future development would just be a straight subdivision in that case. So some of the zoning districts already don't allow PUDs of less than 2 acres. So this would essentially sort of change that to 4 acres, but you will have updated subdivision regulations that are more up to date. Probably the most significant piece that won't exist initially if you don't have an infill would be something that was like you know, a little cottage court on 3.5 acres or something like that. On the commercial side, many properties today choose to be PUDs under the current rules for 2 reasons. One, essentially to get waivers of various different dimensional standards, and 2, to combine a couple of adjacent lots for density purposes. The first of those 2 we're likely going to be solving, as you saw in the waiver memo that I sent out in this packet. We are proposing to allow for some very minor adjustments to dimensional standards through site plan review. So all those projects that want, you know, a 2-foot waiver wouldn't have to be a PUD to get a 2-foot waiver. The DRB could judge whether on a case-by-case basis those 2-foot setback changes is fine. The combining properties for density purposes, you know, I think in the future under an infill PUD, it wouldn't just be you're combining to get for density purposes. You'd be having to do something to make it a PUD, and so, you know, there may be alternate ways to get at, if somebody, all they really want to do is combine for density purposes, then maybe that's an opportunity for infill TDRs. And if they want to do something more elaborate, like an actual small PUD, then it could be an infill PUD. So I think, long story short, I'd like an opportunity to just run this by the consultant, but it's probably okay the way Monica's describing it. And certainly staff is fully in favor of helping to get this project to a reasonable finish line.
Cool.
And I would just add, when looking at what we did before with her, in the simplest way, it would keep us focused on parcels that are 4 acres and above regarding PUDs. We don't have to get into the if 4 above versus if 2 to 4. That's where we have to completely fracture ourselves. So it would keep us more focused on parcels that are 4 and above. Right, Paul? Yeah, so.
Duncan?
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Michael.
Me, I had my hand up ages ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was just your hurt hand.
That's this.
Okay, well, Duncan hasn't said anything all meeting, so we'll let him go first.
All right, go ahead, Duncan, as long as it's quick.
Okay. No, my question is quick. I'm just asking Monica, can you what you were at, which section you to delay?
Section
15C.08.
15C.08, which we don't have any text in for yet. It's the last in this list.
So it's
Okay,
currently blank and we haven't received it yet. So I think the idea is that maybe don't focus on that now. Michael?
Yes, I had made a couple of comments which we haven't, for whatever reason, we haven't dealt with, and I'll just mention them now. At the beginning of this section 15C.
Wait, I'm sorry, Michael, your comments are so important. I don't want to lose, because we go in deep on them. Can we resolve this one first? Did we need a motion, or do you guys want to think about it, or what would the process be? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Michael. I just want to close the books on this one.
I'm okay with the suggestion after Paul's explanation.
So can I make a motion that we remove section 15C.08 from the current draft of, and reconvene on that after interim zoning and this first portion is complete?
Second.
As long as it has a very high priority for us, because I don't think we should let it ride. Infill and redevelopment are critical.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with it.
Any other comments or questions, or Paul?
Just that, so I've got the direction clearly. Again, I'd just like the opportunity to make sure that there's not something that I'm missing as to a major side effect that I haven't thought of. But so with the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, this one thing is a major side effect. If you're okay with my coming back to you with that, then I'm perfectly fine with the motion.
Makes sense.
Sounds like lots of nods. Okay, anything else on this, or, okay, all in favor? Aye. And Paul Ingalls, was that an aye? Okay, so that was unanimous. Very good. Thank you very much for closing that out. And Michael, to your point, the reason we haven't gone over your comments yet is because they came after, we haven't talked about any of this since you sent them, so.
Well, some of them go back quite a while, but I'll just mention them because I don't want them to be lost, and maybe you didn't see them. But at the very beginning of 15C PUD, Plan Unit Development, I said that we need to add a statement that where there's a conflict between this article and Article 12, Article 12 should control. In other words, we don't want to do something here which undermines the work we've done on Article 12.
I thought it did say that.
I don't see any reason why that would be a problem, Michael. The only thing that we would need to make sure that we cross-reference is the conservation PUD does create certain allowances related to properties that are heavily covered in natural resources, but that's addressed in Article 12, so that's not a conflict, it's just a cross-reference. But otherwise, I think that's the intent, so I'll make a note to make sure that that is very clear.
Right.
Right. And the next one may have been new because I had to dig around for it, but we've lost the statement that these regulations implement the relevant provisions of the City of South Burlington Comprehensive Plan and any adopted, where are they? And any adopted amendments to such plan and are in accord with the policies set forth therein. In the event of a conflict between the provisions of this chapter and the comprehensive plan, this chapter shall control. That was at the beginning of every chapter, and it's disappeared somehow mysteriously. And I'm wondering why.
Yeah, so two things related to that, Michael. One is there is a statement at the beginning of the entire land development regulations that says essentially what you just said. And so from a drafting perspective, it's at the very beginning and doesn't need to be repeated over and over and over. So it was just to save a little bit of space. However, in addition to what I was saying, you'll see that in the PUD chapter specifically, there is a reference to conformance with the comprehensive plan, which is a unique requirement in state law that in PUDs, it is required by state law that local regulations that have PUDs have as a condition of review for the DRB consistency with the comprehensive plan. So that should be in there, but I can send you the, or send the whole commission if you like, the blanket statement that is the beginning of the entire regulations. That's the reason it's been removed from the beginnings of each of the sections.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's,
And it is in there, Paul, under B, purpose, that paragraph.
and then under the general, so 15C04A is a whole little section on conformance with the comprehensive plan. It's on page 5 here. So does that feel like that covers it, Michael? If that statement's at the very beginning and then it like specifically references the comprehensive plan?
I don't know. I just think that the original text is much more understandable and much more specific than what we've got in the purpose here that Bernie just.
But if you refer to what Jessica just did, that 04C, I mean, it's basically one sentence that says that the PUD must conform to the city's comprehensive plan. It's on page 5, about halfway down, 15C.04.
511.
Yeah, 5 of 11.
Yeah.
And it's really quite specific about.
Yep.
Very.
Yep.
I got it. I'll try and be quick now with the others that I think we haven't talked about. Well, on page.
Can we just do it in order from the beginning and you can bring them up as we get to them, Michael?
Okay, I am going through them in order, but if you want to, yeah, I can stop
Just
you.
that Paul's already got other annotations to discuss.
Okay, we'll go page. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Paul's bringing it up. Yeah, it is a good point. We want to make sure we get through those red and blue comments, and as well as anything anyone else has as we kind of go down through this.
Sure. So I'm gonna jump as I go through to each of the next red and blue comments. But if commissioners have anything on the way, please just say that you do. I have nothing on page 1. I have nothing on page 2.
I have on page 2 very short things under the third bullet point. We should decide whether we're going to use exclude or conserve and not either or. Line 5, that is.
The reason that it says exclude or conserve, Michael, is that in a traditional neighborhood development, you must exclude level 1 and hazards, where it is in a conservation PUD, it's part of your PUD to be conserving portions of it. So we could clarify that by saying, depending on the PUD type, exclude or conserve, but that's what it's trying to say.
Okay. And line 14, allow for viable forms of compatible infill. I would, since we're going to be talking about infill later in the year, I would replace that with encourage compatible infill. And redevelopment instead of allow. Encourage seems to be a little more encouraging.
I mean, and that seems reasonable. I mean, I think we do want it in previously developed areas and the utility served areas. So that seems in line with comprehensive goals. Does that seem reasonable?
Yep. I mean, it's not for me to say, it's up for the others.
Yeah, it's just semantics between allow and encourage. And I mean, both basically say we want it. So I'm good with either way, I guess.
I like the encourage.
Okay.
I'm fine with that change. If you want to do that, I think encourage sounds a little bit better.
Very good. Moving down.
So now we're in the blue on page 3, right?
Yep. Okay, the big blue section.
All right, this is one that you had started to talk about at your last meeting, and we sort of, it felt a little small discussion for when Sharon was there. So the question here, and you may find that you want to defer this to when you talk about actual density, but the two questions here are, currently as drafted, the most of the things from the underlying district get replaced by a PUD. The things that do get kept are your minimum density and the uses, the allowed uses in the underlying district. What we've done with uses is, for a traditional neighborhood, we've created a small handful of uses that are very neighborhood based. They're the ones that, if you remember a couple of years ago, you allowed certain uses to be in master planned properties like South Village. It's like a small retail shop, a small restaurant, a small personal instruction facility. So the draft of this automatically allows those into a TND, but otherwise the only things allowed are the things in the underlying zoning district. So the question for you is, if somebody happens to have a planned unit development that's split between two zoning districts, so for example, the O'Brien neighborhood that is under review right now, the part by Kennedy Drive is in a mixed commercial district, and the part on top of Old Farm Road is a residential district. Do you want to allow the uses, should the uses basically stay with the underlying zoning district and say that, the thinking that went into those districts still carries forward in terms of where the quote unquote intense parts of the neighborhood should be, or should they be allowed throughout? And then on the density side, do you have any particular thoughts on whether the minimum density should just be whatever is from the underlying zoning district, or should it be a blend or something like that?
Michael?
Yes, I had said at the last meeting, and Sharon seemed to think it was workable. I said if one district is in the SEQ NR or NRT or VR or VC, use that density. Otherwise, apply the higher density of the two zones to both. And Sharon seemed to think that was a workable solution.
Bernie?
I'm just wondering if there's any unintended consequences to that. I think it might depend on what the abutting zoning districts look like. I'm certainly okay with going with the underlying zoning district. So if you have a more commercial kind of district on part of the PUD to have, you know, higher density and, you know, different kinds of businesses, and then not extend that to the other part. But I'm not opposed to extending it to the other part as long as we don't have any big differences between zoning districts that abut, because then you end up with an unintended consequence of, you know, maybe having, you know, expanding out a really high density commercial feel where you really don't want it. That would be my concern.
So I'd have to take a look to that one, Bernie. The example of O'Brien, I know that there is an area there where there's a 12 unit per acre density zoning district next to what is essentially a 4 unit. So that I don't know if that one, I'm mentioning that one because it's already in preliminary plat, so it's passed, but that kind of thing could exist. That would be my only concern also, Michael and Bernie, is if there was a big disparity of all of a sudden your R4 has become an R12 minimum.
Right, and that's exactly my concern. Like I said, I have no problem keeping the underlining zoning for each, but expanding out, I think you expressed exactly what my concern is. You have an R4 and all of a sudden it becomes an R12, you know.
Yeah, when no one was doing it. Duncan?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this in relations, I don't know how this would work with transition zones. Is that something that would come into play when you go from an R12 to an R4? Is there a transition zone going from there that could be blended between the two that would sort of, is that what we're looking for in the transition zone, is to mitigate a transition where you go from a 12 to a 4 or something like that?
Typically, Duncan, the transition is to what is physically built next to it.
Okay,
so if what was next to it was, say, 12 units an acre, and this was going to be, and the PUD was going to be less, then it would ramp down. And if what was next to it was single family homes on 3 acres, then it would ramp sort of up. You could sort of building on the bullet point that I have here in 4A is you could build in a transition area if you wanted. You could say that in the 50 feet or 200 feet or whatever distance you want to say that, you know, either density can be applied, or that it can be something like that. I wouldn't, you know, necessarily try to make it too complex because there's already a lot of sort of tricky parts about these PUDs, but you could give some discretion in there for what to do with those 2 areas.
Monica?
I would say in terms of uses, it seems like sticking with the intended use. Like if we said before you can have a mixed use component in this area, it seems like that was done for a reason. Maybe it's by an intersection or something else. And it seems that uses should stay connected to the original underlying zoning. But I would be curious from a density perspective, if we're talking about a new development that doesn't have a neighboring aspect they need to be concerned about. I think that giving the neighborhood character some flexibility would be good. I mean, give in order to create the best you know, integrated neighborhood with different housing types. It seems like why separate them if there's a logical way to create a different neighborhood and leave it to, you know, so maybe there's some principles around it, but if there's a really good idea for a more integrated neighborhood, you know, and it's being done together, it seems like that should be allowed to be looked at as a whole rather than being divided.
Ted, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Monica in part, but I also think there's circumstances where we run into trouble where suddenly there's a very dense proposal in not such a dense neighborhood. So I think a transition should be an option to be considered. You know, if it can't be integrated, as Monica says, that at least there can be some kind of transition, so it's not sort of a stark, suddenly 12 units in a R1 or whatever it might be.
So Paul, it's almost sounding like the idea of applying the highest minimum for the whole PUD might be a little scary, like where it would bump up against the other zoning district. Like maybe we do need to go with either the, like Bernie suggested, using kind of the base density for the actual areas of the zoning density or the zoning district, or that blended minimum could be reasonable, because then they could apply it maybe a little more evenly throughout the PUD and be, but we're not just kind of loading on extra density. Bernie?
Well, I was just going to say, I also like the idea of transition. So, you know, having the underlying zoning, and then if you're abutting two significantly different things, you know, having a transition from one to the other over a certain distance makes sense. And that might address some of the, you know, the blending things to make it flow better.
So we do have some transition language in here already. It's not in this exact spot, but it's more about the general layout of the whole PUD. I'm wondering if that already starts to address what people are bringing up.
The building type in itself does. The whole building type premise says that you have to complement what's around, right? And have a more of a transition from. So the building type rules would almost require a reasonable transition.
Yeah, it's also though related to density and, for lack of a better term, commercialism in terms of transition as well.
So to help us move on here, I think I'm hearing from the majority of the commission that and I guess I'd propose to see a draft where the minimum is based on the underlying district. The maximum, again, is just the building types and applies across. It doesn't matter what zoning district it is. And then I only heard Monica speak up on the uses, but I didn't hear anybody disagree with that. I think for simplicity's sake, that's going to be a lot simpler to start with, and you can always make edits in the future.
Could you also give an example of the proposal that Sharon made, which is, you know, assign density by percentage in each zone to arrive at a blended density?
You mean verbally, or do you mean in writing to you?
Well, I don't want you to do it now. No.
Okay.
You can,
yeah, we can do that. Okay. If you're comfortable.
Okay, and Paul moved on to the next one. We can go down there.
No, I did have a comment here, which I sent before, which was that in a conservation PUD, it's intended to preserve large tracts of working farm, forests, and other resource lands, but we should add.
Where are you, Michael? What paragraph?
On the where we're talking about blended density. Or maybe I'm ahead of you here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm on the next page. Sorry.
So I've moved to page 4 at the top, B1 and 2.
Yep. That's where I am. At number 2. Excuse me. So, to quote, conservation PUD is intended to preserve large tracts of working farms, forests, and other resource lands. And I think we need to add or consists of grasslands, shrublands, farmland, hayfield, and other agricultural land, which I think comes from the comprehensive plan. So it would cover. It would more properly cover what we want to see there.
Wouldn't we just use agriculture and that would fall under all those categories?
No, agriculture wouldn't cover a grassland or a shrubland that's kind of adjacent to a habitat block, for example. Hayfields might, but grasslands and shrublands are important, particularly adjacent to habitat blocks.
Paul?
So conceptually, I don't have any disagreement with Michael in this, in the sense that a classic conservation PUD is intended to encourage folks to identify the important natural resources on that property and protect them, where the city wants to retain the amount of development that otherwise would have been allowed by the underlying zoning district, but wants to be more compact in the form of it. And so conceptually, I have no concerns about that. My only, especially because this is optional, and since it's optional, I'm not quite as worried about the definition of the things that Michael listed that would normally be a concern, but since it's an option, they can present it. The only thing that I would bring to your attention is Sharon's comment in the second paragraph about determining where this option should be allowed. So, for example, if there was a property right along, say, Shelburne Road that qualified here, and for whatever reason a property owner wanted to choose a conservation PUD, would that be acceptable? Sharon's recommendation is that there are certain parts of the city where you may not want to see somebody make that choice because you've got other city goals to achieve. You're already protecting the hazards and the level ones, as you know, regardless of the development type. So this would essentially be saying, no, we don't want to see more land conserved in this area because in a given area, because the priority here is to make use of our infrastructure investments. So that would be my one thing that I'd like to sort of balance that conversation with and see, what your thoughts are on that.
So my suggestion is simply to add at the end of that sentence, after the 10 and 12, the words "or consists of grasslands, shrublands, farmland, hayfields, or other agricultural land." How you're going to decide when and where that's applicable, from what you just said, is not easy.
Monica, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, I have a eureka idea that I tried to warn a few people here about because it's complicated. I hope this is the right place to bring it in. So as I was looking at this, and I'm really want to make sure that we are addressing TDRs within. So the concept of a TDR is that you're adding density to what you're hoping to develop by using a TDR. I don't know if we can't apply that same method and simply say, look, there are required minimum units assigned, period, to every, zoning type. If someone opts to use a conservation PUD, potentially anywhere, and they are not over the 50% hazards and whatever the allowable is, then they have, a landowner should have the right to do what they want with their land. However, if that land is deemed to have this minimum density to it, that in the same way that you buy a TDR to get more units, if you would like to not develop the minimum units that are required in order for us to meet comp plan goals, then you can buy out of that density by making a purchase of some kind of credit to the housing trust fund. Because what that would do is enable more affordable housing to happen somewhere else. So it's kind of like having a reverse of the TDR program, and it would give the landowners flexibility so that we're not telling them where they can and can't do a conservation PUD, But what we're in charge of is making sure that we're meeting the comp plan goals by setting those minimum densities. So basically give people a buyout to go to a lesser density and help.
Didn't we, I'm sorry, isn't that incorporated? I think it's in the part that's down about conservation PUDs. We talked, Paul, you brought that up in terms of like, I think how did you put it? An estate lot? Isn't that similar to what that situation might be if somebody said, I don't want to do a PUD, I just want to do 2 or 3 big lots? Is that kind of what you're talking about,
So
Monica?
if we take that example, let's say that that lot though says it's supposed to have 12, right? But they don't want to do 12, they want to do 3. Then, but as a city, we need to make sure we have 12. So there is some kind of similar to a TDR value placed on, them not building the needed units, and that fund goes to support the city sanctioned fund that can help create those homes somewhere else. And ideally still working within, it's not to send all to another place. There may be a parcel that's next door that does want to exceed and go use their TDRs, and perhaps the Housing Trust Fund could help that neighboring parcel make some of the land more affordable for the development. So I know it's complicated, big thought here, but I can't help when my brilliance kicks in. Sorry.
Can you use the value of the TDRs of average value of a TDR?
But 12,000.
Yeah, I don't know.
Bernie?
So a couple things. So we are on B1 and 2, correct? On the top of the page here?
Yes.
Okay. So my first comment is 1 no longer applies per what we talked about earlier on infill, correct?
Correct.
So that would have to be struck?
Reserved or struck, yeah.
Or reserved, yeah. And then 2, I guess, Monica, you've confused me with this whole discussion, because this really is a very short sentence that basically talks about when you're going to use a conservation PUD, and then all the language is later, I think. And so I guess my question is I think we're just looking for a short answer on this short sentence, right? And
yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the question here, and Michael has added to it in terms of the additional things that could reach your 50%. But the fundamental question that Sharon was posing is, are there certain places in the city where even if you reach your 50%, that you do not want to allow for a conservation PUD because other things are the priority? That if somebody,
that's the concept that I brought, that's what the concept I was presenting connected to. It's like, instead of saying, no, you can't do that there, it's saying you can do it anywhere, but yeah.
Ted?
You can do it anywhere but what? Monica, you stopped at the but.
The conservation PUD and the various categories that Michael had mentioned. Now, could they be person-made? In other words, could one plant, an acre of wildflowers for birds and so on, and that would, and if that would put you at that 50% would allow, so one can do that. It's not natural, correct?
Well,
I suppose that's right, Ted. I mean, I think, just to sort of reset the discussion of the conservation PUD, the overall purpose of the conservation PUD is, if you were to think about the underlying zoning district and you said, that zoning district allows 4 units an acre. The city, by allowing a PUD, would be a conservation PUD, would be saying, we're still letting you build those same 4 units an acre, but we would like for you to build it only on 30% of the land. Because we want to incentivize your protecting all the things that we see as important, and they can include, you know, whether it's human created or not human created, it's really the list that you come up with. So it's really to give the property owner the opportunity to be neutral in what they otherwise could have built as a standard subdivision. I think that where this gets the question of geography is, you have other PUD types where you are specifically encouraging intense development, like a neighborhood, like the NCD, which is encouraging, you know, multi-story buildings over all of the property that is not a hazard or a level 1 resource or designated park space. So, you know, in that choice, would you be okay with somebody doing what the underlying district is, which is probably a little bit less?
Mhm.
So that's really sort of the values question here. But yeah, to answer your question directly, however you define it, if you'd like to define it, I won't be out there measuring whether it was human created or not human created as a grass field, grasslands, excuse me.
Right, but you know, to your point, Ted, you know, agriculture is one that we've talked about. You know, we had actually even at one point had an agriculture PUD as a separate type, and then when we decided to get rid of that as a separate type for now, I thought we had said that the agriculture would fall under the conservation PUD, so that if someone wanted to conserve agricultural land, they could use the structure of the conservation PUD. So I do think that at the very least, we want to be adding the agriculture back in as an option. So, Monica?
So back to what I was trying to suggest is, if you go on the opposite extreme in terms of what, if you limited, the word I'm using that cautiously, if you limit conservation PUDs to lots that are heavy in what we identify and map as hazards and level 1s and are like absolute no builds, those absolutely can qualify for the conservation PUD. But for another parcel that isn't mapped hazard, something else, that still the owner can opt to go the conservation PUD if they want to, no matter whether it's grasslands, whatever they want. They simply would have to help create the housing units that they're preventing from being there somewhere else by making that. So that it limits actually the things that we have to tag within a conservation PUD to the things that we have mapped. And so it alleviates any of those other questions. But people have the right to create one with the flower garden that they planted, if they so choose, as long as they are working to replace the housing that they would prevent from being there.
Duncan?
Can I ask a question? Was it Sharon's intention that we look at not allowing conservation PUDs in certain areas of the city? Are there certain districts where they're not allowed already? I can't.
So they are allowed in certain districts, period. And those are typically the more residential R4 and below. So you can just do that. And they are allowed in in other districts if it's more than 50% hazards. Sharon is suggesting that you might want to limit that to certain districts to basically avoid your big commercial districts to where that's an option. And instead, what would happen in a district like that is, let's say you had 10 acres of land along Shelburne Road and 3 of them were hazards or level 1 resources. You would set those aside entirely because they can't be, and then the other 7 would become your neighborhood commercial. So you would say you don't have the choice of being a conservation PUD and conserving 70% of that land, because the priority in the city is that along Shelburne Road, if it can be built, meaning it's not the things that you've already set aside, then it should be built. That's her recommendation based on, what the, based on the other comprehensive plan goals. But this is your choice, and there's no wrong decision here.
So I guess what I've said is that those grasslands, shrublands, etc., would count towards the 50% in this item. In addition to, or if hazards level 1 and level 2 resources.
I don't know, and I'm sorry, I will, the last thing I'll say about it, because I do not mean to push it. If there's some thought, if what I was suggesting can be seen as a way to simplify, I don't know what the next step would be. If it sounds like what I'm proposing is just far too complicated, then I won't speak of it again. But as soon as we get into exactly what we're talking about right now, then who's to say what should fit what? It shouldn't. I don't know that it matters if there's the hazards that are mapped, period. There's the level 1s that are mapped. That's clear. Habitat blocks, clear. It's going to be clear. To me, this just starts to introduce questions again. And so why not just say it's the things that are mapped, or if you want to do it wherever, maybe not on Shelburne Road, maybe there's certain areas that we say not an option. But anywhere else, if you would like it to be a conservation PUD, okay. But if you were supposed to have 100 home units there, you're going to be paying a good sum to ensure that those 100 units can be supported somewhere else versus just forgoing them. I think allowing a conservation PUD where we are intending through the zoning to have, substantial housing, that creates the conflict. So I don't know if there's a way to think about it more thoroughly somewhere, somehow, or if it's just too complicated, I'm fine to let it go.
Do you have an example of any property that you can think of? I'm just trying to grasp what a particular property would look like if it were considered a, PUD, conservation PUD.
Using this example I'm talking about?
No, because you're just simply stripping the TDRs. I'm thinking of what the density would be in a particular conservation PUD as an example somewhere.
The best example I could think of, Ted, off the top of my head would be if you're on Bartlett Bay Road, and it's not a perfect example, but if you were on Bartlett Bay, Holmes Road, and you cross the tracks, on the right is the Farrell Estate, and on the left is another piece of land that is probably 10 or 12 acres in size. It has some fields in it, it has some forest in it. It could qualify under being 50% or more. It's not a perfect example because it's on the other side of a set of train tracks, but it is within, call it less than a quarter mile of Shelburne Road. And so it could be an area that you would say, if and when that's appropriate for development, it's very close to transit served development, and we would want to see that built out for all the land that we have not already said is off limits.
Mhm. But they
That's
could-
probably not a perfect example, but it's probably as close as I can think of off the top of my head.
But they could choose it to be a conservation PUD, right?
Well, that's the question for you all,
Right.
is do you want to allow them to choose it to be a conservation PUD, or would you tell them, no, sorry, you're too close to Shelburne Road. We're
Right.
only allowing you to be a traditional neighborhood. You must
Okay.
build out that land. That's really the question. And then Michael's question is sort of a subset of that, which is what gets to qualify you to hit your 50% if you're choosing to? Can you add in grasslands and shrublands, which I don't have a problem with doing that. But I would sort of nest it in the first question of, are there places geographically where you don't want to allow that?
Paul, do you think it would be helpful to go back up to page 3 where there's the table where it kind of talks about all 4 districts, or all 4 PUD districts, and like which, so I think that we're really talking about the 3rd row here, the conservation development, and really that first piece of it, the any zoning district which 50% resource threshold is exceeded. That's really the one sentence that we've been talking about this whole time. And then also the conservation PUD could be in all those other listed ones, kind of regardless of size and regardless of resource percent. Is that correct?
Right. So it's an option for all of those other districts, regardless of how much land you have in natural resources. You don't have to meet a minimum 50% threshold in order to qualify.
So if I don't know if that even starts to get at your point, Michael, if you were in any of those more rural districts, you wouldn't need to add a different resource like a grassland or something else to qualify. You could do a conservation PUD kind of regardless of your hazard percentage and resource percentages. So this 50% threshold really comes into play in the other districts, like the other districts which are currently zoned at a higher density. So I guess I'm wondering if that influences the discussion, because
Well, maybe we could leave this at this point, and I would circle back to it and look at Article 12 and see where what I'm suggesting might be applicable.
yeah, because in
'Cause
any
we-
of those, the R1, all the R1, R2, Lakeshore, and the SEQ districts, they can have meadowland, grassland, agriculture, all of those things would apply as the areas that could be conserved. We're really talking about having to meet this 50% threshold in the higher density areas of the city. So
Okay.
yeah, so I
Do
don't
you
know.
want to circle back to this?
Let's move on. I mean, one of the other ways is maybe you can't have one of these conservation PUDs in our urban design overlay district, for example, because it's all built up. But let's move on. We may come back to it when we get back to Article 12 at a future
And
meeting.
just for the record, I would like to circle back to this other conversation as well. I mean, if there's anywhere in town where underlying zoning has a minimum, if for any reason that minimum isn't met, I would like to discuss this other option of doing the reverse of a TDR, because I think it can be a good solution for us meeting our housing goals that are in the comp plan while allowing conservation.
Yep.
Okay, so the next question here is bottom of page 4 about what can count, and Sharon's question for you is, how do you feel about a planned unit development being potentially non-contiguous to itself, or having multiple owners? I guess what I would suggest at this point, in sort of keeping with where you were at the beginning of this meeting, is to say that at least initially that they be contiguous parcels. We don't really worry about multiple ownership as long as they all sign their name to the application. And so that would be my recommendation for now. This can be something that you revisit and say, oh, do you want to allow a PUD that's not contiguous to itself? But it's a little bit tricky, and I guess I'd recommend, in the interest of moving forward, to not have it for now.
To not have what?
To not allow for a non-contiguous PUD, that the parcels need to all be touching one another, or be across the street, but not be dispersed in different parts of,
So it would read that a PUD application must involve one or more contiguous properties. Or
may involve one or more contiguous, and then strike the part that says or non-contiguous.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
okay.
If you're okay with that, I think in the interest of not adding complexity.
Yep.
Okay. I had nothing on page 5 specifically.
I did on page 5, what is it? Yes, A, right at the top, that we should add a statement of conformance with Articles 10 and 12, I think, which we've done elsewhere.
I think they're just required to meet those standards in 10 and 12. Like you said, 10 and 12 don't go out the window just because they're doing the PUDs. And that's something that, I think, Paul Engels, you had brought up, we don't want these waivers to be overriding our environmental protection standards. So
Michael,
I think say that.
Sorry to cut you off, Jessica, but the top of the next page, C1, I think addresses Michael's concern. So the prior one was about the comprehensive plan. This is C1, and it says any provision or standard under these regulations as applicable to the proposed development that is not superseded shall remain in effect, including relevant resource protection standards under 10 and 12.
Perfect.
And we can probably be a little bit more clear in there, per your discussion last time, about making sure that when we talk about waiving, we don't mean waiving of 10 and 12. We just mean specifically the things that a PUD itself modifies. So yeah, but I'm previewing that that's going to be your question, Michael.
Yeah, in A, it's talked about conformance with the city's comprehensive plan, and in the next page, it talks about Articles 10 and 12. They're talking about two different things. That's why I thought we should, if we're talking about conformance, then that a statement of conformance with Articles 10 and 12 would be appropriate in where I've suggested.
My understanding, Michael, is that in the statutory language, the state statutes use the word conformance when speaking about plans and use the word compliance when speaking about regulations. So I think that's what Sharon was trying to do, was to say conform with the plan, comply with the regulations. So I think she's trying to do exactly what you're saying, which is you must comply with Article 10 and 12. And compliance is a more direct word.
Comply is pretty definitive.
Okay.
We're good?
Yeah, anything
Yeah.
else?
My next comment was not, or question was not until page 8, and this comes back to the subject of density. So if anybody had anything before that, let me know. So the question here, and Michael had a question, I know in your notes from the 22nd of January about the minimum density. So to be clear, what this section is saying is the area within your buildable area, which again has already removed all the hazards, all the level 1 resources, and has taken out has applied the allocations. You've already taken out your open space and your streets. The area designated as residential at a minimum must be either 4 units an acre or whatever the number from the underlying zoning district is. And though that sounds a little bit odd, remember that the number from the underlying zoning district applies to the entire property. So it's a gross density number, and this is really just net. So it's actually quite a bit. It's not saying that you have to build, if you're in a 7 units an acre district, it's not saying that you have to build 7 units an acre across the entire property. It's 7 units an acre within the residential portion. So the question that the really key question here was, or two of them were, one, how do you feel about a number that is higher when you're either in a transit served area or in the center of your traditional neighborhood? And two, I guess we'll come to this later, but there's a conservation PUD question also.
So you're basically asking about the double I, the little number 2.
The double I, right. So, you know, do you want to require that if it's near a transit service or in the middle of in a mixed use area, i.e. the middle of your TND, that you must in that portion of it be 8 units an acre, or do you want to just leave it at whatever the base is across the entire PUD? I think the intent of doing the higher number is to make sure that you've got a center of activity and that you're assuring that near transit service you've got high density. But you know, we don't have a ton of these properties, to be honest, and so it's not likely to come up that often either way.
If it's in
Would it
a,
ever be higher than 8?
if it's on
In
a
other words, are
transit,
there underlying zoning districts that are higher than that, where we might want to just, again, kind of refer back to just do it per the underlying zoning district?
There are 2 areas where we have an R12, 12 units an acre. They're pretty small and they are, I think, built out at this point. So I think everywhere else is going to be the highest that you're going to see is 7.
And 10.
Okay.
Is that
Where you allow a TND. You may have other areas that are neighborhood commercial like Shelburne Road, but yeah.
Now, does that include
Yeah, I just wanted
TDRs?
to make-
Does it include TDRs?
No, remember this is the minimum density, not the maximum.
Mhm.
We haven't really brought TDRs into this yet in terms of how they would apply. I suppose that you could put something in where your minimum increases through the use of TDRs or something like that, but it doesn't account for TDRs yet. I have some ideas and some thoughts on how to bring that in, but it doesn't yet.
I think it's an important issue because so often people are thinking, well, there's 8 units per acre, and then lo and behold, it's significantly more than that. So I think we really, whenever we talk about things, we truly have to provide the maximum density that could be on the property, as well as minimum, but so everyone knows, no surprises.
But those would
Yeah.
all be building type PUDs now. So this is the whole problem with TDRs and the affordable housing density bonus. If we go to the building type, it's it's as much as they can fit as long as it's working within the appropriate building type. So it's going to be a huge communication issue or need to address with the community. But to your point, Ted, when we go to building type, the community has to understand that it will be a building type that fits within the area it's meant to be in, but the developers have the ability to create the neighborhood to the maximum that they can within those building types. It alleviates the whole concept of density. You don't need to buy a TDR to get more density. You've got your building type. Maybe you need to buy a TDR to get an additional height or something. Like maybe there's something that we have to find a way. But that plus the other issue of that's where the inclusionary zoning comes into play. So just, I agree in terms of being clear with the community. If they expect that it's an R4, so it's only going to ever have 4, it's never been that way. And now with the building type, it absolutely won't be that way. And no one can say what the maximum would be because it depends on the type of housing that the neighborhood designs. That's just the new.
Right. It's not that we can't give the number. It's that the number, and at your next meeting, we're going to talk about these numbers. We can give the numbers, but it's a range. And within that range, the numbers get influenced by the design that you choose. And so it's not just, you get to put a 50-unit building plop it in the middle of the neighborhood to get a lot of development. It's that yeah. But your point is well taken, Ted.
So Duncan?
Yeah, no, this brings up a good point, and I've struggled with this mightily. The density equation, I guess, for lack of a better term. I think if we're struggling to understand, it's really going to be hard for the public to understand this. I think, Ted, you have a very valid point. I think people are really going to want to know, okay, if that property can be developed, what can it be developed to? And I agree. The building type, I struggle with trying to figure out, okay, what can they actually build there? So I guess what I'm saying is there some way we can clarify this and put it in layman's terms or simpler terms that people can understand it? Because I think if we're struggling to understand it, I think it's going to be hard for the public to understand it and really grasp, okay, what's happening here? What can be built here?
I
I would
think
just add to that
Duncan,
the other side.
very
I would
valid
just
point
add
there.
to that, Duncan, the other side of that equation that we'll have to communicate to people is that there may be some unknowns in terms of what can go there, but at the same time, remember that we've now better secured more natural area. So it's a little bit of a give and take in that there is more land that will be protected, more resources, more habitat blocks that don't have any protection right now that are getting it. But in exchange for that, we need to understand that we need to look at things more holistically. So it's tying those two pieces, always tying those two pieces together.
I hear what you're saying, Monica, but I still think that people are going to look at a piece of property and when they see a large building going up, that's we're going to get holler back, for lack of a better term. I'm sorry.
No, and I think that's right. And I think that a big piece is the transitions, and another big piece is the building types and making sure that they're appropriate. So as Paul said, our next meeting, we're going to have a chunk of that dedicated to really like diving into the density and what it looks like on the ground and some of those numbers. So he's been working with the RPC to try to get that together for us.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah, and so I guess, Paul, I guess I'm thinking with this little double I here about something like Mayfair Park. I mean, I know it's built out, so you wouldn't be plopping something in the very middle of the neighborhood, but 8 dwelling units per acre. I don't know. I guess it feels like a big number, but maybe it's not. So I don't know if we came to a conclusion on this.
Well, it's a good question. Could one tear down 3 or 4 homes in the middle of Mayfair Park and put a
Double it.
very different building in?
Well, that would
Well,
be an
so-
infill though.
Right, so you'd need to be at least 4 acres in order to do any of these things. And then you would need to meet transitions to what's next to you. So realistically, on 4 acres, by the time you're done transitioning, you're back to the main.
Okay.
I guess my recommendation in this area, given, I think classically, the idea of a traditional neighborhood and requiring that the center of it and the areas near planned transit routes are high density makes strong sense. I think as a practical matter in South Burlington, there's not going to be very many instances where we have a property large enough for this to apply. And so I guess I'm thinking that maybe I communicate with Sharon and suggest that either A, we remove it for the time being and think about coming back, or B, say it only applies to a PUD of more than, say, 20 acres or something. So that if it is a truly classic PUD that's a large one, it's being thought of, but that we're not worrying about things like, the one property where the Ethan Allen Motel is in Mayfair Park, and the 5 acres that are there that sort of touch Mayfair Park.
Paul, do we need to know this answer tonight? I guess I'm just thinking about what I just said about our next meeting where we're really going to try to visualize some of this density. If maybe once we've had like the examples you're putting together and what residential effective density of these levels really looks like, maybe it could help us decide then.
That's
Hugely very helpful.
Duncan?
Yeah, I agree with that approach.
One question. Why did you choose half a mile versus a quarter of a mile from a transit zone?
That's a great question, Ted. That
Isn't
was
that the walking
Sharon's
radius?
proposal that she did half a mile. Typically, a quarter mile is what's used for transit. I think she was proposing, I don't know, I'd have to ask her.
I would opt for a quarter, but I guess I'd need to be convinced why a half.
Yeah, a half's pretty far.
I think we should stick to what we have elsewhere in the LDRs, which is a quarter mile.
Duncan?
Yeah, actually, Paul, I had a question. Interesting enough, the property you brought up earlier, down over the railroad tracks towards the lake.
Yep.
In relation to what we're talking about here, would that qualify within the transit district? I'm just wondering. Think about that property and what would we want there?
That would be.
That's within a half mile.
I think it's within a half mile, but outside a quarter mile. That's a guess off the top of my head, but I think that's where that would probably show up.
Because that's a pretty interesting parcel to think about in terms of that. That's
right. And again, this is really just establishing what the minimum is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would support the half a mile, and I want to personalize this for you guys because we talk about numbers. I'd like to personalize 2 examples that have been I've heard about. I know somebody who was living in the very beautiful Larkin apartment building on Shelburne Road, and they had to move because it was extremely loud. Okay. Second, there's someone who lives on Market Street with her children, and every time she walks out of the building and her children want to play, there are signs everywhere saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, because they're on a road and it's not safe. So we need to keep the personalization of all these things in mind. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a higher density that's a half mile from, where there might be a more safe existence for the people that are living in those units. I don't think it should have to be right on,
Bernie?
Yeah, I would just say I'd advocate for the half mile. It seems like a meeting long ago and maybe far away, Sharon had provided justification for the half mile in terms of walkability. And we are trying to encourage, pedestrian walkability to transit and things like that. So I guess I would stick with the half mile unless, somebody gave me a compelling reason to go less.
Right. So it's sounding like maybe stick with a half mile. At our next meeting where we can visualize the density a little better, we'll check in on that 8 units per acre effect. So, okay, anything else on this one, Paul?
I think that's all I've got for the moment. I'm just going to see if I've got anything else in this PUD chapter. That's all I had for the PUD chapter.
Okay. Before we move on from PUD chapter, does anyone else have any comments or questions, including the public, on this PUD section? Okay, and there were a few comments along the way from Sandy in the chat, and Sandy, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. I sent a number of questions to Paul, and I think I also sent them to copy to Monica and Jessica about conservation PUDs, and I'm just wondering when we'll get some answers to those, because the committee, as I understand it, or at least the chair and I have would like to have those questions answered.
Okay, so conservation PUD is later on in our agenda, so we are slowly moving through. We're still on A. So it's kind of that first section of the PUD, and now we're gonna get into the TND, the traditional neighborhood development piece, and then we're gonna get to the conservation PUD piece.
Oh, okay.
So we're still just moving along slowly here.
I guess there was so much discussion of conservation PUDs around what could count toward the 70% and what the dwelling units, the minimum densities were, that I was thinking we were focusing on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Okay, that looks like we have another comment in the chat. Andrew says redesignating what used to be the maximum density as the new minimum density seems like a dramatic shift in zoning. Would be very helpful to understand the impact of that. How will you make the decision to adopt the change? So Andrew, at our next meeting, we're going to actually be visualizing with some examples what these numbers are really looking like, as well as some numbers on impact kind of to the bigger picture. So that is on the agenda for our next meeting. Okay, then let's move into the TNDs.
All right, I think I only had a handful of questions in the TNDs, and I know Michael had a few that were fairly specific, and you can decide if you want to sort of just leave those as homework for me to work on, or if you'd like to discuss them. But so this again is the design of the traditional neighborhood itself, and these become the design standards. One thing that's mostly a note, but I wanted to draw your attention to, is that the draft here says that homes are not supposed to face onto arterial streets. The idea being that you turn the corner like in many of our neighborhoods, and the homes are facing onto the new street, not the main street itself. I think that makes good planning sense, but we would need to go and update the arterial roads either in the comprehensive plan or list them out in these regulations, because it's a really funny hodgepodge of roads that we actually list as being arterials. It's not what you would think they are. I think Spear Street is considered an arterial, and Airport Parkway. There's some odd roads that really are collectors, but they're listed as arterials. So with your okay, I'll either sort of take a crack at that or delete this language for now, because I wouldn't want to have this weird side effect where a road that everybody thinks is a neighborhood street actually is prohibiting homes facing onto it.
Yeah, I'm not sure you want to necessarily delete it, because I do think there would be times when we wouldn't want to have, you know, house driveways out onto the road. But
And maybe we just list I mean, we don't have that many roads that are major roads. Maybe we just list the roads that you cannot face onto.
Yeah, maybe that would be an approach.
It might be a better approach because arterial, someone might try to define that outside, you know, with the transportation technical language, like a VTrans definition.
Yeah, exactly.
We're really trying to define it with the feel of the road rather than the traffic count part of the road. So
Yeah.
Right.
So you think that VTrans already has a definition, Jessica?
I think,
I'm sure they do.
yeah, they do. And it may
Arterials
not,
are pretty well defined in transportation.
Okay, let's get it.
yeah, I mean, I guess if we can look at that map and just see if it makes sense, then we could use that.
Okay. I have a feeling you're going to find that it's not the ones that you want it to be, because it includes a number of 2-lane roads that historically were the arterials, you know, 100 years ago in South Burlington, but have evolved into being what more people would consider to be something becoming a neighborhood street, even or a collector street, even if they're a little high speed at the moment. But I'll bring it back to you.
Thank you.
All right. The other things that I had in here were specific to the building types. So this chart here, which I know is a little hard to read, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of the TND. This is sort of the equivalent of, you know, to use a what Paul Engels had worked with us on. This is sort of the building envelope standards equivalent in the form from a form-based code. So at the top is your allocations, your minimums and your maximums, and you'll see that we've put in an idea that you'd given us feedback on before, which is to say that you could incorporate some resource land into your PUD. So typically in a traditional neighborhood, you're either building on it or it's excluded from the PUD entirely, and it's you know, it's left out of the PUD. This was an idea that I think you all had brought to us a while ago, which was, well, what if somebody did want to integrate, like South Village, a farm into the PUD and really have it be part of it? So this is trying to accommodate that. That's not what classically a PUD would be, but you know, we're on the forefront of of thinking creatively about how to integrate resources into PUDs. The other comment that I had is sort of goes back to your the last conversation that you just had, and so I think what I will do is, rather than rehashing that last conversation, it's essentially the same thing we just talked about, those 8 units an acre. So why don't we reserve that for next meeting when you talk about it?
Can I just ask a question, Paul? Sorry,
Yeah.
before you move past the 30 and Prince 40 feet height limits, and then it also kind of connects to the resource land maximums. You know, I know that height is, especially when you're thinking out in residential areas, is of concern, but there are arguments that if you have more height to a building, your footprint is smaller, potentially, right? You can, if you can keep a smaller footprint and have more height, you're naturally going to be saving more resource around you. And I don't know, just I would hate to block out a really good, smart, progressive, environmentally friendly idea because of a number that we just put in as a maximum. So I don't know if there's a way to, we start with this, but if there isn't a smart, good idea out there, and they're doing it in the middle of where no one else is around, and it wouldn't block anybody's view or whatever else. Why not let that be considered?
Monica, you had some good examples a ways back, I forget, that you sent to us, and I thought those were very intriguing. A lot of open space, it had merit. But
That's my
again,
family's.
I really want to be sure. Again, I keep using the word Russian housing, like around Taft's Corners, as long as it's not something like that. And I don't know how we preclude that, but that's atrocious.
Well, so we have the building types. I mean, maybe the heights are tied to the building types a little bit better, or maybe there's a core area where the height actually varies depending on how far away you are from the adjoining areas. Duncan or Bernie, you've had your hand up for a while, actually.
Yeah, so just a quick comment. So one of the letters that we got from one of the citizens mentioned building height versus view shed. So my only comment was we need to be careful about building height in certain areas, that we don't end up with a bunch of, fairly tall structures that are, blocking the view of Campbell's Hump or something like that. So.
Duncan?
I was just thinking of what Monica said. Would that be something that could be addressed under the, not the waiver, but what do we put?
The alternative compliance?
Yeah, is that something that could be addressed there? If that was
potentially, yeah. I think the way this was put together is the building types speak about stories, and this speaks about feet in height. In our residential districts today, typically it's 28 feet is your maximum, so this does bring it up a little bit. And remember, height is measured to the midpoint of a pitched roof. And so in actual fact, it's a little bit taller. I don't have a problem with necessarily either allowing it to be a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, or as Duncan suggested, putting that as something that can have some alternative compliance to it, so long as it's not changing the building type in and of itself. I think that this is the building types are really the key to making sure that the concerns that you've raised about compatibility are met, that you don't have a 40-plex next to a single family home. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I know, Michael, you got your hand up, would be that we do have some language in our current zoning which we might want to carry through in terms of transitions, which talk about how much difference you can have in height from the things immediately next to it. So that's the things that I think you've heard the most concerns about, and I'd recommend keeping something like that.
Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I need a bit of explanation on some of the items in this table, where we talk about in the first column, residential neighborhood area, and we seem to, if I understood it correctly, we are taking what was the maximum underlying zoning density and making that the new minimum. And then there's no minimum shown, which normally the minimum is some proportion of the maximum.
The minimum is the column that it says 4 or 8, and the maximum is the one that says variable. The way that
the language says the minimum equals the base density or the maximum specified for the underlying district, whichever is greater.
I think that this may be a matter of writing this more clearly. So I'll have a graphic at your next meeting to try to show this in more understandable terms to everyone. But just to try to say it once here, the currently, let's say you're in an R4 district, the district of your the maximum specified for the underlying district is 4 units an acre. That is applied over the entirety of the parcel today. In a traditional neighborhood, a TND, what would happen is that first, anything that is a hazard or a level 1 is excluded from the TND to begin with. So if you've got 20% of your parcel that's in a hazard, it's not even in your PUD. It's a separate subdivided parcel. Then the top 4 rows at the top of the page get applied in terms of your allocations of space. So here it says 10 to 30% civic space, 5% mixed use or non-residential, and residential's on the prior page. I think it says 65 to 85%. It's on that 65 to 85% that your minimum applies. So that 4 units an acre from your underlying zoning district is only within that area. And so while it's using the number from the underlying zoning district, it's really not, it's not saying that your old maximum is your new minimum, because it's on a smaller area.
That's gobbledygook to me. So what does variable mean then?
Variable means it's the building types that determine it. So again, what you would do is you would have a minimum and a maximum amount of any given building type. So a single family home, a duplex, a triplex, that kind of thing. And you would, let's say you have to have at least 3 different kinds of buildings. And within those, none of them can be more than 50% of your development. So what you would then do is the developer would have the choice of saying, oh, I'm going to do 50% single family homes, 30% duplexes, 20% triplexes, or the inverse. Each of those bring with them their own lot sizes on which they would be built, and that becomes the output of your density. So it's variable based on the choices that you make within what's allowed to be made.
So give us an example of a theoretical maximum
That's
density.
what we're doing next meeting, right?
Yeah,
That's
so
what I'll have for you for next meeting,
that's
Michael.
the focus of the next meeting. So maybe we can circle back to like exactly what these numbers should be.
More than happy to do that. I think that that's the right thing
Because
to
I
do.
think it might be the most clear, because we'll actually have something to look at.
Well, I'm trying to understand the document that's in front of us, and I've made this question. I've asked this question 3 times already, and I've sent it to you and Paul, written, and it's getting deferred again. Okay.
Why it's on the
Fine.
agenda for next meeting. We needed time to prepare that information. So.
Okay, can I go then down to where it says building lots? I just need to understand if the minimum building lot is 2,500 square feet and the maximum is 10,000 square feet, does that mean if I had, does the 2,500 feet minimum mean that's 16 lots per acre?
So yes, with an asterisk, Michael. So yes, it means that is what can be done. However, as I said before, the 2,500 square feet is only available to one of the building types. So for a single family home, for instance, as drafted, and this is all can be edited, you need at least 5,000 square feet. So if you chose to do single families, then you'd only be able to put 8 per acre. If you had some duplexes, or I think that the 2,500 square feet is the townhouse type, then a townhouse can be on just 2,500 square feet on its own, but you can limit the amount of any type allowed in the PUD. So you could say that there's a limit of 50%. You may say that for a townhouse, it can't be more than 15% or 10% of your entire PUD. And so yes, for that portion of it, it could be 16 units an acre, but that's where the setting the minimums and maximums of each building type actually directly affects density.
But in theory, if I have 40 acres, I can have 640 lots.
Not if the regulations say that you can only do a small proportion of them at the small size.
Does the regulation say that
well,
anywhere?
Well, and you have to remove your roads and all the
Talking
you
about
remove
40.
the roads and the civic space and the
Yeah, Jessica, I'm talking about 40 acres of buildable area.
Yeah.
well,
So,
I'm still
yes, Michael,
saying
it's on the next page about the amounts. I do think that there's some work to be done to set those to where you want them to be.
Yeah, because somebody else reading this, a layperson like me, is going to make the assumptions that I have made because that's what the language reads. So
Okay.
we need to fix.
I was just going to comment that the chart in general is difficult to read it when it has like one box representing something that relates to things that are not in the chart. It is a confusing chart. The percentage of civic space and such is fine, but when you start to get into, I would look at those last 3 sections and really question if this is the right way to convey that information, because it is a little bit confusing given the multiple types.
Okay, I think the point is taken and we'll work on it. I think what Sharon was trying to do with this chart is the left-hand column is the absolute minimum that could ever be allowed, and the right-hand column is the absolute maximum that could be allowed, and all of the types exist within that. So she was trying to create a framework, but I understand what you're both saying, and I concur, and we'll figure out how to say this in a way that is not misleading to people.
Because if the density is the variable density is extremely high, which it could be, then and the development happens to be in the SEQ, that would reduce or make worthless the value of TDRs. And I don't think we can break the promise that the city has made to landowners who have TDRs and agreed to the original SEQ zoning. I think we need to be careful here.
Understood.
Bernie?
Yeah, I was just going to comment in the way of clarification, Paul. It seems to me like at one point Sharon provided some graphic examples and pie charts with like typical layouts and stuff. So that may be helpful as well.
Yes, I met with the graphical consultant last week, who is, I put them basically on hiatus because we were getting sort of towards the end of our budget with them. So I said, we'll work with tables for now, but it is fully understood that this needs to be much more graphical for everybody else's use. It's just very expensive to make graphics over and over.
I agree with everybody that the table is hard to understand, but some of those really pretty pictures that Sharon presented early on with kind of the pie charts and stuff, I thought very useful.
Bernie, are you referring to the block diagrams which showed various different layouts of different building types?
Yeah, for different neighborhoods, but then there were pie charts that told, how many of each kind and stuff, and it was graphically, it was just easier to understand than trying to wade through a table. So.
Okay.
Okay, anything else on the charts or?
Just to wrap that up, Bernie, is this, hang on. This is the kind of thing that you were speaking about, right?
Yeah, that's what he's talking about.
Sorry, let me unmute. Yes, that's what I was talking about.
Okay, good. Yes, it is in our work plan to do this. It's just, we'll be sure we've done that.
We want pictures.
Well,
Me too.
and the little table to the, it's just a lot more brief and
easier to understand.
kind of tells you how to get from A to B. So this is exactly what I was talking about. Thank you, Paul.
Okay,
And that would ultimately go in the LDR, right?
yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
So that's all I had on the TND for the moment.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments on the TND? Or any from the public?
Were we the percentage of building types, is that going to be reserved for next meeting with density?
I think so. I think that what I'd like to do is talk about the ways in which the output of density can be manipulated by you all, if to hit the right spot for what you're comfortable with. And there's 2 or 3 different levers that you can push and pull. Oh, actually, I think I did miss one comment. I'm sorry. Sharon had a comment / question about the amount of land dedicated to civic space, which I think might come back into the same question again of density, but currently you're requiring a minimum of 10% of the developable land to be set aside as a civic space. And Sharon thought that that might be something that you want to bump up a little bit. Yeah, so maybe save that for your density discussion because they all kind of relate to one another next meeting.
Ted?
Yeah, one issue that I've gotten a lot of comments with regard to dog parks. And there are a lot of dog owners in this city. I'm not sure how many have registered, but it's something that I'm not sure where and all of this stuff we should start thinking. But when you talked about open space and so on, we should really give some consideration as another added item to consider, because I think it's very important to a lot of people. And if we don't, the repercussions are in the natural resource area, defecating there. And so there's all kinds of problems. And I think, Paul, we had a conversation with you about the report. I'm not sure if everyone got it yet, but a very extensive dog park report. But that would be great to have everyone see. But something to consider when we're looking at developments. One more thing, but I think it's
Sure. So, Ted,
So-
on that, in 2 weeks' time, I'm meeting with the Recreation and Parks Committee to talk about this project and specifically the open space, the civic space types. And there's 2 components to the civic space types. There's the land itself, and then how the options for how to amenitize that land. And so I'm happy to bring that feedback to them. I'm sure they're also thinking about this subject area, but what's the appropriate venues in which to incorporate dog runs or dog parks into civic space?
Mhm.
And when is it not appropriate?
Before we move out of this item, Paul Engels, we haven't heard much from you. Did you have anything on this TND or PUD section before we move on?
No, I had the COVID shot this morning, so I'm kind of like,
Oh, dear.
kind of tried to keep up,
Okay.
Second one?
Yeah, and the first one I was during that meeting when I left at 9 o'clock. I'd had the COVID shot that morning too. So.
Well, if there's anything from follow up afterwards, let us know.
Yeah, I'm doing okay.
I have a question. I have a question for Paul Engels. Was the second shot a lot worse than the first?
So far not. I just feel kind of I don't know, just kind of out of it. That's about it. I know some people who have gotten pretty sick with fever and stuff, but I haven't had any reaction like that yet at all.
Because I've had one shot and I felt nothing.
Yeah.
Except I broke my. There was a very interesting submission to the Planning Commission by Kay Woord, van woord, as I would say in Afrikaans, but it's probably Dutch, which I think we should look at very closely before our next meeting. There was some really interesting and valid information in her submission to you.
Yeah, I think not only hers, we've actually gotten quite a few different letters and input that I don't know if everyone got a chance to look at all of them. Some were coming in right before the meeting that I know got sent out by email, but make sure to review all those. Not yet.
I've seen most, I think I've seen most or all of them.
Yeah. So I guess I know it is getting late. Are people okay to move on to the conservation PUD follow-up questions?
Yep.
Paul, I think this was important, you thought, for Sharon to be able to keep moving. And Paul, you're on mute.
Unmute, Paul.
Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. I do have some detailed TND questions, but they're not really critically time sensitive. So I think we can come back to them. They're really about some very small building design issues. I think this would be, if you're willing to talk about conservation PUDs, they'd be, that's really sort of the next important subject here.
Great.
So I listed out some questions in here that Sharon, our consultant, is really sort of looking for some commission guidance on the key issues that you've got. Depending on what you're looking to get out of the PUDs, there's some, the conservation PUDs, there's some important decision points here. And so I don't know if you wanted to start from the beginning. I guess that you've already really tackled 2A in your prior conversation. And I think that, yeah, I think that, and I think in 2B, this is sort of the amount of conservation. I've drafted this up for the first bullet here about what should your 70% be. I've drafted it such that it excludes your hazards. So
Wait,
oh no, I'm sorry. The density excludes the hazards, but this is, I'm sorry, I'm also getting a little bit tired. The question here is, when you're thinking about conserving this at least 70% of the land, what are you conserving? Is it 70% of all the land, or is it 70% of the land after the hazards? And do you want to just think about that? And I understand it's a little bit of a technical question, and maybe you need some graphical things and a recommendation on that. But that's one question that Sharon had. The bigger question that I think I'd really like to get into tonight is, what do you want to do with this possibility of estate lots or small clusters? That's really the big question that I'd like to tackle tonight.
It sounded Monica had an additional idea. You have a couple options here. You list out 3 different potential ways of handling it. The greater conservation amount, land dedicated to a public entity, or reserving land for future development. So you would still meet the minimum density with that last option by putting aside that land. So I guess if people have thoughts on that, we can weigh in.
Could you just read those again? I'm sorry, I didn't see those.
So it's in 1B. So it says estate lot with small cluster allowances. Basically, if someone didn't want to meet the minimum density requirement, what would they do? So the 3 things Paul's listed is the person could do a greater conservation amount, something like 85% or more of the land area would be conserved. Or maybe that additional land could be dedicated to a public entity, and maybe that could be even parkland or something like that. Or the third option that he had put forward here was reserving that land for future development by a future generation. So So that would be kind of figuring out where additional density would eventually go and kind of setting that aside, reserving it. Duncan?
Yeah, Paul, I had a logistical question. Do we have any idea how many properties might fall under this purview or scenario?
Well, you had said previously that you would like everywhere in the lower density districts, the R1, the R2, and the Southeast Quadrant districts, that everywhere that could be a TND could also be a conservation PUD. As a practical matter, how many would choose to do this estate lot cluster thing? Probably not too many. That would be somebody whose personal choice led them to that. Likely you would get at least a couple, because we know that recently or at least something along those lines, recently a couple of properties were purchased that have a deed restriction on them that limit the total number of homes. So there's at least a handful where the former Dorset Meadows project had been, when the land was sold, it was sold with a caveat that there can be no more than X number of homes on that property. Interestingly, and just for the commissioner's note, that transaction took place last fall. As of January 1st, 2021, that kind of deed restriction is now no longer legal in Vermont for any new deed restrictions. So the recently passed legislation in the state actually says that no private restrictions can be placed on land that would preclude the development otherwise allowed by local zoning, unless it's to be donated to an entity like the Vermont Land Trust.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah. That's part of the housing support bill that was passed last year.
Yeah.
So a handful, Duncan, it's hard to say how many. I know that you've had a couple of people speak to you at the Planning Commission interested in it. And the comment that Jessica had made about reserving for a future generation is an interesting one, because typically in these conservation PUDs, the land that you're conserving gets set aside, period. I don't know, it may be that there are some folks who would like to do something for the next 30 or 40 years while they're living on the property, but would the city want to reserve the possibility that that could live as something else 50 years from now?
I'm sorry, real quick, and I'll finish up. I think he's on the call or on the meeting. Vince Bolduc brought up something like that along those lines. Did he not, with his property?
Yep.
In the letter he gave us. Does anyone else remember that?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well-written letter.
Yeah. I don't want to put Vince on the spot, but if he had any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear them. I know he's on the call.
Can you hear me now? I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Yeah. Duncan, clarify that. I thought we were on the estate lots.
Yeah, no, I thought that you had indicated a desire to have a couple of lots inherited by your children. Maybe I misunderstood the letter.
That's not my intention, but it's certainly a possibility. I'd like to know what the possibilities are eventually.
I'm sorry, I thought you had some suggestions on that. I apologize. Maybe I misremembered the letter.
Nothing specific. Thank you for thinking about it, though.
Monica?
Yeah, so my comment, I like what you suggested with the reserving the right for future. It's complicated, it's like, then I don't know, it could be complicated, but it's a good idea. My comment is just going back to the comp plan, being consistent that if somebody's looking to do less than what the comp plan is asking, a landowner should have the right to do that. But we can't forget that the comp plan is not just about the dedicating to either greater conservation or dedicating to a public park. There is that other side of it. And I think it will help everybody kind of come together if we always make sure that we're keeping that other side of it in as a consideration. So, reserving land for future development does that, because it says yes, because the comp plan expects this to happen. And so we want to reserve the right to maybe let that happen someday. But, are there other options as well that could help lead to the comp plan goal of housing?
Yeah, Bernie?
Yeah, just maybe a concern on the future development of future generations. My concern would be kind of a piecemeal kind of thing where, you set aside 3 lots and then 5 years later, you want to do 3 more lots. And the next thing you know, you've kind of, built the whole thing out, so I'd be concerned about that. But, if, you're conserving that land for future development and you kind of only do it one time, and then, if it's going to be developed, it has to be in accordance with one of our PUDs, and maybe not the conservation PUD at that point, maybe so, I don't know. Anyway, just something to kind of put some boundaries on that, so you don't have kind of piecemeal, we're gonna set 3 aside, and then now we're gonna set 3 more aside, and then we've used up the whole 40 acres with 40 houses on 1 acre lots for the extended family or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I think maybe talking with Paul, I may have actually come up with this list at one point, but it felt to me like if someone wasn't meeting the goal of the minimum housing, maybe, at least for our discussion, there were other goals of the comprehensive plan they could be meeting instead, which is why the land dedicated to a public entity is. I mean, it feels like there's so many places in our city we could use more sports fields and recreation space and parks, and maybe that would be a goal that or dog parks. So it's really for discussion with this group.
Well, but sorry, can I just respond to that? That's where there's this disconnect though for me, because it's removing density, it's removing housing, and not just moving it elsewhere, it's just removing it and removing the places that it can be. And we have a housing crisis, and we at least need to constantly connect back to that. And I'm not saying that a landowner has to be forced to do something. They absolutely should have rights within their property. But, we have the comp plan states housing goals. I think we've been hearing this, that there are housing issues. So we have to have something that connects back to housing in some way.
So I guess just to not argue against you in any way, but just to say there is only so much land in South Burlington, and a place that isn't developed yet, and if we specify all those spots need to have housing, where would a new park come from? Like I get what you're saying, but I do feel like there's of the land, there may be additional goals also that are kind of competing for the same land. And I think this is a point that Ted's brought up an awful lot of times. If all the remaining land goes to development, where are we getting these other things like a new park? So I don't know.
Can I respond to that? I mean, every PUD is going to have a park in it. Every PUD is going to have civic space. We've just added habitat blocks. We've added a lot of conservation. you know, and I'm not saying there needs to be a house on every available open space, and that's not what I'm saying, but with what we're doing today, we have added so much more open space, and people are going to use it. So it just seems like the one that is being held back the most there, you know, it would be, and it's in the comp plan, these numbers. So it should at least be an option in every scenario. So I'm glad that you added the reserving the land for the future versus them only being give to a park or conserve more, but always make something to support the housing goals, at least an option.
Michael?
Yeah, I'd just like to, in addition to what Monica said, that we have a housing crisis, we also have a climate crisis, which we need to consider. And, you know, open space is crucial for that. We don't have a whole lot left in South Burlington, but we do have some. So I don't think those two statements compete with one another. There's a place for housing. It's a worldwide crisis, which we can obviously not solve. We can ameliorate it here in South Burlington, and we've done quite a lot of work in getting Chapter 18 through the Planning Commission and into the LDRs. But they're not mutually exclusive. There's a place for each, and this is not a housing. The Planning Commission we aren't dealing with housing as a housing committee here. We're dealing with what kind of buildings, what kind of development there should be. So I think we need to bear in mind that there is a climate crisis as well as a housing crisis, and both have worldwide implications. We can only do so much here, but we ought to do whatever we can.
I'm reflecting on the comp plan. That's what I'm reflecting on the math of the comp plan. And if when we get to review renewing the comp plan, if we change it, so be it. I'm just presenting that we are obligated to support the comp plan. So if ever there's a you can, here are your options, it just should always be incorporated as an option, is all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a mandate. I'm saying it's an option that always has to be there.
Yeah, we want to remember that the comp plan was written probably 6 years ago. And a lot has changed since then about our understanding of the impact of development and the conversion of farmland and open space to urban development. So, you know, the comp plan is a little out of date, and quite often I hear from, I won't say who, but I hear, oh, well, the comp plan is purely aspirational. And you're right, Monica, we ought to follow the comp plan because that is in fact the vision of South Burlington as written by the citizens of South Burlington.
So I guess just what we're trying to do here is, it sounded like the commission, you know, we had gotten some public comment and the commission seemed a little uneasy that the only option for a landowner was gonna have a minimum density associated with it. So this was really kind of trying to think about, like, is there another option for a PUD that wouldn't, would add a little more flexibility? And I think that you even just spoke to this, Monica, like give the owner some amount of options, but still is doing something kind of for the greater good of the city, or meeting comprehensive plan goals in some way. So I guess the question here is, do we even want to have something like this? And if so, is having some options something like these 3 or 4, or Monica presented one earlier where someone could buy out with the housing trust fund. Do we even want to do something like this to give a different alternative?
So just to quickly, just a couple of quick things on that. You know, one of the things that might make an estate lot different from the other development in a PUD, regardless of the type, is that an estate lot probably doesn't follow sort of the traditional block layout that you talked about in the subdivisions. And so this would really be, you know, if somebody wanted 3 acres, it's really kind of, or 2 acres even, would be a departure. And that's as much as whether you choose to have a minimum density or not, this is also a departure. And so thinking about, like, if somebody wanted to have 2 acres, would that be acceptable as opposed to a much smaller one? And if so, you know, under what conditions? And I think you've presented a number of options here, but you know, I think the key question is, are you comfortable with any circumstance like that? One other thing that we talked about way at the beginning of this that we really haven't come back to was the idea, sort of to Vince's point, of you could allow for parcels larger than X to have a singular carve out that is not subject to the PUD standards. So you could say that you know, in a parcel of 20 or more acres, that you could have no more than 5 or 10% of it cut off as being just a straight subdivision without doing a master plan, without doing all the PUD, but that's a one-time thing. So it's really a question of, you know, how.
Yeah, I think that was something that Sharon suggested in the case that we discussed when she was with us at maybe the last meeting. And we had a case in point where a landowner could have a choice. He could do what you just suggested, or go with the conservation PUD. You can have these estate lots. We had one landowner come to the commission and describe exactly that he had, I don't know how many acres. Let's say it was 20, and he had 4 children, and he wanted to give each child a 1 acre lot, and the remaining 36 acres was the conserved part. That, in other words, that was his lot, if you like. 4 lots for his children of 1 acre each, and 1 lot of 36 acres for himself. I think that was what he had in mind, and I think Sharon said, well, in that case, it would be just a simple subdivision. Because you could
certainly do that, and then you could say anything beyond that is subject to all the master plan requirements for that remaining 36 and or, you know, PUD standards. I think that, you know, the key question though is, what if those 4 acres are right in the middle of it as opposed to being along the edge of it? Or is 4 the magic number? What if it's 5 and then 6 and then 7?
No, I just picked a number. I don't know.
I think you brought up a good number, but I think that those are sort of the practical questions of, you know, would it be acceptable if those 4 little lots were right in the middle of the property? It's sort of precluding future use of it, either for conservation or land development, or and if that is okay, is there something that has to be done in return?
No, in this case, I think the landowner would have to commit that the remaining 36 acres remain open, undeveloped, if that was his intention. He can't have his cake and eat it. If he wants to do a simple.
Right, Michael, I think that's exactly the question. And then the question for you as a commission is that an outcome that you as a commission would be comfortable with for a part of South Burlington's land? And that's really a question that only you guys can answer.
Well, let's remember, it's not South Burlington's land, it's the landowner's land.
Yeah, the land in South Burlington. So, Bernie?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of go along with what Paul was saying on these estate lots. I do think there needs to be some, again, kind of delineation of what we want to do in the future. So for example, if we allow them to do, like you said, 4 1-acre lots with 4 houses and there's 36 acres left, I do think we need to put some constraints on what we allow for those 36 acres. So,
Definitely.
I have no problem with the things that Jessica had listed, the dedication to a public entity, reserving for future development, as long as the next bite of the pie for future development has to be, in accordance with, like Paul said, a master plan or conservation PUD or another type of PUD. But again, to not keep, piecemealing it, that we allow the landowner an opportunity to have some flexibility for the future, but one more bite of the apple, and that flexibility for the future has to be in accordance with our regulations, I guess, and some of these things that are listed here.
And, I think Sam just brought up in the chat, that remaining land would be private. How is that consistent with goals in the comp plan? So I think that's the big thing. Like what is the city achieving from kind of giving this flexibility? And
well, it would be private for the short, for whatever term that person owned the 36 acres, but it's some, so it would still be an open 36 acres until they decided to sell it or do something with it. And I think regardless, Paul, even for the 4 acres, the subdivision regs would apply, right?
Yes. Well, so I guess my specific question, Bernie, is what if the landowner were to decide to permanently disallow future development on those 36 acres through their own restrictions? Is that something that you would be comfortable as a commission, or would you like to say that, only if it went to an entity like the Vermont Land Trust, or only as a temporary condition that, just saying that a future master plan would be needed?
Well, to me, it's no different than like if they own it now. So if they own 40 acres and it's 40 acres that's undeveloped, they could own that 40 acres and will it to their children, and it could be 40 acres of underdeveloped land for perpetuity if that's what the landowner and their heirs decided to do. So,
okay, so you're essentially thinking of this as a carve out of saying you could do up to 10% or up to X number of acres without being subject to a PUD and a master plan, but then whatever you choose to do afterwards is subject to it. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that you carve out your 4 acres and you give it to your kids, and they develop that in accordance with the subdevelopment regulations. Well, can't even talk anymore. And so you have 36 acres left, and so that person has there's 36 acres, and they continue to live on it, and they will it to their children, and it stays open or whatever. But if at some point in the future somebody's going to do something with that land, then they've already taken the bite out of the apple for the 4 acres. Then then they have to dedicate it to a public entity at that point, or you've already reserved it for future development. So at some point, if somebody wants to develop it, then they have to develop it in accordance with the regs. But up until that point, to me, it's no different than any other open land that's currently available. But what I don't want is, like I said earlier, I don't want it piecemeal that, well, we're going to subdivide 4 acres and build 4 houses on it and get a subdivision regulation. And then, oh, now we've got grandkids, so we're going to do another 4 acres and another 4 houses, you know.
Right. And that's
You
the
get one
exact
bite of the
purpose of the
apple.
master plan,
Yep.
to preclude that.
Yeah, no, I concur with what Bernie says. I think if somebody wants to do that, they need to be, they can do it once, but they are then stuck with it in perpetuity. They can't, as I said, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can do your subdivision but the 36 acres, that's it. You can't do, you can't subdivide it in the future. You can't, you can farm it, but that's
No,
about
I'm
it.
saying, Ted, I'm saying, Michael, but that you could also develop it in the future.
Because that's what
Well-
Monica was advocating for, that it could be reserved for future housing.
Yep.
With being an option.
Yep. So, you
Yeah. Provided that,
or you've got 36, but that 36, once it gets time to be turned over again, it's got to be developed in some way.
Yep.
Or dedicated, for baseball fields or whatever, but not piecemealed and, 4 unit chunks.
So I think what I'm hearing here is that rather than sort of creating a special PUD type for an estate lot or a couple of estate lots, to allow for a carve out that doesn't apply to the master plan, doesn't apply to PUDs, and then say the remainder of the land is subject to the master plan. It is subject to whatever PUDs are allowed at the time. If it's just a conservation PUD, it's just a conservation PUD. If it's a conservation and a traditional neighborhood 10, 20, 40 years from now, then that's what applies.
And that would follow if the land was sold.
Correct. All regulation, all decisions follow with the land.
Okay, that seems like a very
That maybe addresses the concern without sort of handcuffing future decision making too.
And I think with that, we just do need to make sure there's some language so it's not right in the middle. So you're not promoting some kind of poor layout that really destroys the whole piece.
All right, Paul, can I ask a quick question? Are there any size parameters for this exception? I mean, we're saying it has to be a parcel total of 20 acres, or can somebody do it with 8 acres?
Yeah, I think you'd probably want to have a minimum size to it, because otherwise there's not really any point to do it. It's just an end around on the rules. So let me think about the number. It's probably somewhere in that 15 to 20 acre range. And I'd say probably the amount that you could cut off might be sort of, I think, Michael, whether you intended to or not, I think that something in the neighborhood of not more than 10% probably feels about right. That is substantive enough that it can be done with, but not so big as to preclude the rest of the area from being something useful, whether that's, farmland in the future or a neighborhood.
Yep. If it's 10%, we might want to change that other number to, no, never mind.
So I think we probably need to get away from calling it estate lots. It's really like because that's not really what we're doing. We're not taking a 40-acre parcel and making 4 10-acre estate lots. The idea is to have a simple subdivision be allowed for a small portion, because right now we're saying that if there's any, currently as written, any parcel more than 4 acres that did any kind of subdivision would have to go through the PUD process. But what we're saying is, if you're doing a very simple thing, as described, you would bypass.
Right, you'd be able to, yeah. Okay.
Call it estate property rather than an estate lot, because it isn't a lot.
We'll find a way to describe it.
But that owner would still have a right to then, let's say they take their 10% and they build their 4 houses there. they would still then have the right to sell those houses to 4 different unconnected owners. There's no,
Yep.
it's not forever having to stay within, they would have the right to sell, stay in one and sell the other 3 and then leave the other 36 acres or whatever untouched. So until.
I only used that example, Monica, because we had a landowner describe that to us. But yes, those four 1 acre, those 4 homes on 1 acre lots, anybody can have them.
Okay, so I had 2 more questions on conservation PUDs that I think are useful. If you, unless you'd like to, do you feel that Jessica, have you concluded that discussion for now to see some language on what a small carve out would be?
Yes.
Okay. So my 2 remaining questions are, should there be a density minimum within a conservation PUD? And Sharon notes that typically they don't. However, if you chose, you could have a mini TND within a portion of your conservation PUD and say, that's the city's objective. We want to achieve a certain level of density, keeping in mind, of course, that the subdivision rules still apply. And so, this you essentially, you still have to create the blocks where you create the blocks. And then my second question was making sure that as you're thinking about how to achieve the 70% conservation, either because there's more resources on the property or fewer, do we have the right order of ranked importance?
I agree with the rank that's there.
Yeah, I agree with the rank, and I would say no minimum density on the first question.
To the first question, I would say, can we revisit this concept? If there is a minimum density, it's just there. And if you opt to not build to it, then you have to do these choices so that there is a minimal density there. And if somebody opts to not meet what the comp plan is asking them to do, and it's their right because they're a landowner, that they have to do something else towards the greater good. So
Can we
yes, keeping a density minimum.
Can we distinguish between core habitat blocks and habitat blocks? Can somebody define those for me?
I believe the definition if you're talking about the conservation priorities, was areas that are at least 300 feet from the edge of the mapped habitat area. So the intention here was protect the core. If you have to, if your property is 98% covered in forest blocks and or habitat blocks, and you've got some right to build in areas, then start with the bottom of the list and work your way up, so that it's clear that while you can affect a habitat block if you must, then that should be not the core and not the habitat connectors in priority.
Can we add a bullet that says something like non-priority lands or something, just to make sure that, if there's just a piece of old parking lot, they use that first. Like
Sure.
just make sure they're really
well, no, because you don't want an old parking lot to be part of your conserved land.
Well, isn't this for if you
They're conservation priorities.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Because it gets used in.
This was in opposite order in the case where they needed to encroach upon areas, get their 30% developable area back.
It goes in both directions. So yes, we should be clear about that. I understand what you're saying now. Start with unencumbered land for development.
not otherwise protected.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
So we have that language already.
Well, it sounds like maybe we're interested in circling back on that density question during our next meeting density discussion.
Okay.
I think we need to probably get a poll on the minimum density. I didn't click, you know, I tend to lean towards no minimum density as well, but I'm not sure if Monica's the other way. I wonder if we should just find out how people feel about that.
So you mean a straw poll?
Yeah, yeah.
Paul,
Yeah,
could you?
I said no minimum density, but I mean, I'm not strongly tied to that. I guess, you know, it would depend on what the minimum density number was, but.
Yeah. I'd be in that camp, Bernie.
So let's
Yeah.
let's stick with the suggestion to circle back next week when we're visualizing the density on that piece.
Well, and maybe in the meantime, think if there's a minimum density, what could the landowner do instead of that density? You know, what can they do to meet the comp plan goals, you know, so that they're not obligated to do the minimum density, but there needs to be something because it's impacting how the rest of the city functions.
Right. So I'll give this to you for your next meeting, but just to plant the idea with you, minimum density in a conservation PUD would typically be the underlying zoning base density for the 30% of the land that you can build on. So if you're in the R4 district, it's R4, it's 4 times that piece of land. If you're in, say, the SEQ neighborhood residential, the base density is 1.2 units an acre. So it would be 1.2 units an acre times 30% of that land is your minimum.
Sounds reasonable.
And TDRs.
Yeah,
Right,
I mean, yeah.
You wouldn't have to put the TDRs into a conservation PUD as part of the minimum, certainly, because that's not the minimum of the zoning district.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that there are other things in a comp plan that are just as important. You know, we want the quality of life in South Burlington is also dependent on the availability of employment, mobility of transportation, conservation of natural resources, provision of community and emergency services, and opportunities for public interaction and gathering. We have a goal for achieving a reduction of 20% in carbon dioxide equivalents by 2009 levels, from 2009 levels by 2020, through an increase in renewable energy production and reductions in energy use in the sectors of transportation, commercial, industrial, residential, municipal, school, you know, and reduce the number of. We had this presentation today from the stormwater group, reduce the number and forms of impairments of the waterways in South Burlington by 2033. So it's not just affordable housing that we should focus on in the comp plan. There's a lot of other stuff that we should bear in mind.
Michael, you just used up a lot of time to say that again, and I didn't say that. And again, point C, affordable housing committee recommendation, we still didn't get to it. We have a lot of talking going on. It's very repetitive, and we're never getting through our agendas. I'm sorry to be upset.
Are you trying to censor me? You asked the chair if you may speak. Don't try to censor what I'm saying.
And we didn't.
Where I come from, that doesn't happen.
I did not censor you, and it was a very good point, Michael.
I wasn't referring to you, Jessica.
I know. So
I think people are getting tired. We should move on.
I think it's time to take a recess.
It's time to break this party up, people.
Okay, so I know that our next item did say time permitting. I'm going to take 1 minute and say why this is on the agenda. I know that it seemed solely because we're going to talk about it next time. I want you to think about this background. And I appreciate that the Affordable Housing Committee has been on the call this whole time, and I'm sorry we're pushing it to the next meeting, but it's not only on the agenda because the committee forwarded us this recommendation. It's on the committee, or it's on the agenda because it's something that Paul and I have been talking about for a long time, about what happens when we move to the building-based density, and therefore the affordable housing bonuses no longer apply. If we do incorporate inclusionary zoning into the PUD process, we don't necessarily, there's different things we can consider the carrot, the trade-off, without necessarily needing to up the density. So as we're looking at the PUDs, it might make the most sense to include inclusionary zoning as part of the process, instead of a year from now coming back and saying, and now we're going to add on this additional density, or now we're going to add on this extra piece. And I think the other thing that's really been pointed out to me, I have been participating in the Color of Law Book Club, which really talks about like economic disparities across different areas. So some of the census data here in South Burlington has really pointed out that there are certain areas of our city, and Southeast Quadrant is one of them, that is much better off economically. And that is one of the areas where we're, if we don't have inclusionary zoning or an affordable housing bonus in that area, you know, we may kind of be disproportionately representing different groups of people differently. So I don't know, I guess those are just some things to think about between now and the next meeting. You know, the point that there would not necessarily be any incentives for affordable housing in the non-inclusionary zoning areas, which in this case, the Southeast Quadrant is one of those. So we may have ways of having it work without necessarily bumping up the max density. So I think we want to think about you know, pros and cons of doing it now, just as part of what we're doing. So you can think about that between now and next meeting. So I think, is there anything else that, Paul, that you needed to say before we?
Nope, I would love for the street name to be approved if you can take 30 seconds on that. Otherwise, I don't need anything else on the agenda tonight.
Rosetta Lane, or?
Rosita Lane, yeah.
Yeah, I move to approve that name.
Second.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Okay,
Aye.
unanimous, Rosita Lane. Very good. I guess that is all for now. Thank you.
I would like to say, Jessica, and all of you, I don't think there's anybody here who is opposed to affordable housing, and maybe not even opposed to having it expanded to the SEQ, provided it's done right, and we don't end up with unintended consequences, which I'm concerned about. But everybody knows that I've supported this affordable housing work that we've done in the past. I support the Champlain Housing Trust.
So Michael, I'm only going to cut you off because I know Sue has a hard deadline of 10, and it's after 10 now. And I want to make sure that you're not saying things that aren't recorded as part of our minutes. And
that's fine. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.